what are a few of the common myths or misconceptions out there that are actually doing more harm than good when it comes to women's health?
I think there's a few undercurrents here. One, that the calories in, calories out conversation keeps being had, and that women age in a linear fashion. So what they do in their 20s can keep carrying them through. And then I think the other one is a lot of the diet culture that's out there, especially when we talk about cardio and trying to do moderate intensity training and different types of things that are being promoted to women who are 40 plus that can cause more catabolism or breakdown of lean mass and bone than actually building it.
Why do you think that people tend to believe these things despite people like yourself and others coming out and talking about what the actual science and research says?
Long history of how women have been treated in media and media portrayal, all the images now on social media and people promoting something that's not necessarily what they're doing. And it's that rhetoric of this is what someone does, so this is what I need to do to look like them or be like them, when we know that you can have a case study of one and put that out there instead of looking at the general recommendations and going, is this applicable to me? Or is it applicable to someone who's in a different population? And if it's not applicable to me, then what is? So there's a lot of confusion out there because we have the skewing of, influencers. We have a skewing of how women are supposed to be. We have the sociocultural constructs of lifting, like people are look at lifting in a different fashion versus 20 and the 40s. Yeah, it's interesting to see how we have such a cultural divide on how that influences how women are perceiving their health and what they should be doing.
And you talked about influencers and like social media. And I think that's important to talk about because I do think that the way you look is important, right? Like I think people's goals, one of the biggest drivers for people when they work out is ultimately how do they look when they look at themselves in the mirror, right? And I think sometimes that in the name of health and longevity and like not being vain, I think sometimes that gets lost when I think there is a certain level of importance there and that people should talk about that. How can, since we're talking about women here, how can women blend the two? How can they prioritize and take care of their health in a way that they can still appreciate the way that they look when they look in the mirror while also making sure it's not, in a way sacrificing their overall health?
Yeah, I always tell people to look forward 5, 10, 15 years. Like, where do you want to be in 5 years with regards to how you're moving, how you're living? Are you independent? And then let's put another 10 years onto that. If you're 40, what do you want to be doing when you're 50? How do you want to be moving? Do you want injury? You do want to have, better health? Are you independent? And then when we're in our 50s, it's like, okay, well, how do you want to age? Do you want to be 80 living independently without any bone issues and feeling really good and being able to do what you want to do? Or do you want to be in assisted care? So it's kind of I try to marry the health and performance sides together, because if you in 5 years want to be moving really well, we have to look and see what you're doing now. If you're doing nothing but cardiovascular work and you're not taking care of muscle mobility, you're not looking at soft tissue, you're not looking at bone density, then in 5 years, you're pretty much guaranteed, if you're in your 40s, that you're looking at soft tissue injury, maybe a decrease in bone density, and it doesn't matter what you look like. In 10 years, it's pretty much guaranteed that if you just stay this route and you're not putting in strength training, you're not looking at mobility, you're not looking at soft tissue quality, then you're going to be facing this whole issue of low muscle quality, poor mobility, poor bone density. And that's going to directly affect what you look like as well. So we take it step by step.
So do you think that based on what you said, that building muscle is the biggest needle mover for women when it comes to overall health and longevity?
Yeah, across the board. Doesn't matter what age. It depends on how you periodize it or scope what you're doing with regards to resistance training. But we're seeing new and really compelling data come out now that women are being put in the weight room, and we're looking at research on women in resistance training. We're seeing not only does it improve our musculoskeletal aspect with regards to muscle quality and bone density, we're also looking at neuroplasticity. We're looking at improvement of bone density, our agility, our balance, our proprioception, all of those things that make you a very capable, independent human. can be linked to how we're doing resistance training. And then when we look at the cardiovascular work, that is another separate case. We're looking at what are we doing with regards to endurance? What are we doing with regards to high intensity? What are our goals? Because we see cardiovascular outcomes are also getting benefit from doing resistance training.
I'd love to dive into like some effective ways for people to lift weights because there's so many different ways now that people are looking at on the internet or like in real life. There's exercise classes, there's things like Peloton that include some weights in their programs now. There's different things to do at the gym. There's machines, there's free weights, there's lifting heavy, there's, lifting to get toned, like all these things we've heard. What does the science actually say regarding the most effective way for women to train to build muscle?
So I'll put off the bat, it's really, really difficult for women to get bulky. And I think that's one of the stepping fears for doing anything outside of light weights. Because when we're looking at how women build muscle, it's a combination of estrogen and central nervous system. And estrogen is a driver for lean mass development, as well as how strong a muscle contraction is and how fast it actually contracts. It's not like testosterone, where you have an impetus for massive anabolic responses to build and become really bulky. So when we're looking at resistance training, I always tell women any kind of load is great. So if you're going to go from doing nothing to body weight, that's a step in the right direction. If you're going from body weight to some lighter dumbbell work, yeah, that's a step in the right direction. But we're always looking to challenge. So if you're in your 20s and 30s, you can get away with trying a lot of different things. But when you start getting into your late 30s, early 40s onwards, we have to be a bit more specific, where we're not looking at working to failure, because that's more of a metabolic stress. We're looking at lifting heavier loads to work on power and strength, because we lose that rapidly when we start having a flux in our hormones. So when I'm working with women and trying to get them to understand that there's a whole bunch of different things we can do if we want to look at working on power and agility, we need to do things like contrast training. We need to do some plyo work, maybe a pyramid scheme and periodize that way. But when we get into our late 30s, early 40s, we have to really look at power-based training. And it's scary for women because they're like, wait, I've not been in a weight room. I don't know how to do compound movements. What if I've never done anything before? How do I work my way into that? It's like, we phase you in, right? We look at how you move. We do a lot of mobility, make sure you're not going to get injured. And then we start adding load. We're looking at how are we improving our overall physique, yes, but also that physiological response for longevity.
Some people will say, just in the training phases, right, of training, the body differently, that it can be better to train for hypertrophy initially to build some foundational muscle before doing things like lifting heavy weights and doing more like strength focus. Do you think that, somebody who hasn't been doing a lot of resistance training should start on something like machines, some light dumbbells and stuff to build some muscle before doing things like these compound movements and explosive movements like you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not about building the hypertrophy, like muscle tissue itself. It's that neural pathway that we want. And when you first start lifting, be it machines or dumbbells or free weights, you get that neural pathway. And that's what we're after. We're after those motor patterns. Once you have really good motor patterns and some strength, then you can start making it more compound and more complex. Yeah, I mean, something like Planet Fitness, it's amazing because it's opened the doors to resistance training to so many people who never otherwise would have stepped into a gym. But for people who are beyond the machines, it's like, nah, I don't want to go there. I want to find something that's different. So there is that open door for so many people when we're looking at, can I use machines? Can I use dumbbells? Yeah, absolutely. But we want to really look at how we move, and we go sit to stand. What's a great move for sit to stand? It's not using a machine. It's like doing a barbell back squat, or we're doing a front squat, something to that effect.
And so what would you say are once somebody builds baseline level of neural adaptation like you're talking about, what are the top exercises you think people should focus on?
Yeah, I think it varies. I always like to look at it as if you have 3 days a week in the gym, we do a squat focus on one day, we do a push pull overhead motion another day, and then the third day we're doing all posterior chain work. And you can vary the exercises within those, but it's all in planar movement. And are we doing some plyo work in a squat focus? Are we doing some uniplanar work when we're doing our posterior chain? So there's, like I said, there's lots of different exercises that you can do, but we look at it as those are the three, I guess, ideal areas and motions that you want to work on.
If somebody's going to the gym 3 days a week, like what should their time in the gym look like? Let's just say somebody only has like 45 minutes to an hour. Like, how should they break that down when they get in there?
Well, how old are we?
Let's just say somebody who's like 35 to 45.
Okay, so if we have a 35 to 45-year-old woman who's going into the gym and say it's a squat focus day, you go in and you do maybe a 2 minute warm up of sorts to get your heart rate up. And then you get into some mobility exercises. And so, all up, that might be maybe 10 minutes worth of work. And then we go into something like a 5x5 or a pyramid scheme where you're going 10, 8, 4, 4, 2, and getting progressively heavier. And it might be on the 3 or 4 minute. And then we finish off with maybe some dumbbell split squats and then some mobility, and then you're out of there. So all up, you're in there maybe 40, 45 minutes. It doesn't have to take a long time. Like I hear people, I don't have an hour and a half to go to the gym. I'm not asking you to go for an hour and a half. And in that session, if you're like, wait, I don't even have 45 minutes, do some mobility, do your squats, and then get out of there. And then you're in and out in maybe 25 to 30 minutes.
You've been mentioning the word mobility several times in the first few minutes of our conversation. That often falls by the wayside when people go to the gym, especially if they're busy and they don't have a lot of time. Why do you think that people should prioritize mobility when they're going to the gym?
When we look at mobility and being able to lift properly, you want full range of motion. We're not talking about stretching. We're trying to get into the joint and the joint capsules themselves to be able to get triple extension so that your ankles, your knees, your hips all working together to get into the depth of a squat without compromising how you're moving. And people will go and they won't warm up properly. They don't do mobility and their form is off. And that's how we get injured. So if you spend 5 minutes really making sure that you can get into all those corners of those joints and be able to move properly in that pattern that you're going into work, then you are definitely reducing injury. You're also improving the technique that you're working, and you start to see better gains and feel better.
What would you say are maybe 3 or 4 of your favorite mobility exercises that are pretty simple for people to do, that if they want to start to implement these at the gym, they can do so before going into a lifting session?
Yeah, banded hamstring stretch. So it's a thicker band that's wrapped around the rig and it distracts your hip as you step forward to do a hamstring stretch. You do banded pigeon. Also taking a kettlebell and sitting into a deep goblet squat and getting into each corner. So you're moving in each corner. Those tend to open up the hips and the lower back and the hamstrings to get into really good posterior and squat movements.
When I asked you what people's workout routine should look like in the gym, you asked me what age are we talking about. Why did you ask me that? And how should people's workout programs change as they get older?
Yeah, so if we're looking at women who are 35 and younger, well, I should preface that like after you go through puberty, so you're 20 to 35, your body's really resilient and very adaptable. So you can play around with sets, reps, periodization, types of training that you're doing. If you have 40 minutes in the gym, maybe you are doing supersets and compound movements and then finishing with some sprint work. But if you're younger than 20 and going in through puberty, we have to look at functional movement because motor patterns and everything need to be redeveloped with the biomechanical changes that occur in puberty. And then when we get into peri and postmenopause, we have to be very specific because of the ratio of estrogen and progesterone changing. We need to find an external stress that's going to create adaptive responses in the body the way those hormones used to support. So this is why we look at the power-based stuff, because that becomes a central nervous system drive rather than a peripheral or localized drive.
Right. And you talked also about the fear of women getting bulky. And I don't remember if we covered this the last time or not, but I think that, you know, has been debunked pretty clearly over the last, I don't know, 10 years probably. But I think the question still exists, and people, I just have seen people still talk about like, oh, I don't want to lift weights because I don't want to get bulky, or I don't want to do strength training, I don't want to deadlift, I don't want to do a bent over row, etc. Because I'm afraid that if I lift heavy, I'm gonna look like Arnold Schwarzenegger or something. You know what I mean? So, um, from a hormone perspective, talk about why that's impossible.
So if we look at the anabolic responses of testosterone in men, it's not just testosterone. It's the combination of growth hormone and other feedback factors that make testosterone really stimulate muscle development. When we look at women, yes, we have testosterone, but it doesn't work in the same way that it does in men, in the fact that it doesn't stimulate muscle and muscle growth. Estrogen does. So when we look at estrogen, it's not as a potent anabolic agent as testosterone. So when we're looking at estrogen in women, we see that there are estrogen receptors that are in the muscle cell and skeletal muscle itself that is responsible for stimulating basal development, also metabolism, how much carbohydrate can come in to fuel the muscle. We also see that women have more slow twitch fibers than men. So this means that they're more endurant. So they don't have those fast twitch glycolytic bulky type fibers. And the stimulation of our nervous system to women's muscles. We see that they're a little bit slower in the nerve conduction as compared to men because of the more oxidative fibers. So we look at all the combination of estrogen and the morphology of the muscle. It's really, really difficult for women to get bulky. Now, the caveat there is that a woman who's never had muscle mass before will start lifting, and in her eyes, she might be getting bulky, but to everyone else, you can't really see anything except for a little bit of muscle definition. So that's where we have to really caveat and say, look, you're not getting bulky, you're getting stronger, and we see muscle tone, but that is not equating to bulk.
What do you tell somebody when they come to you and they are starting to gain muscle and they feel that they're getting bulky? Like, how do you help them overcome that fear, and then also kind of talk them off the ledge about the benefits of being strong as a woman?
Yeah, I always bring it back to strength and how they're feeling. It's like you came into the gym 3 months ago and you couldn't even bench press two 20-pound dumbbells. Now you're up to two 45-pound dumbbells. And you're super strong. Your posture is better. You're having more energy. Yes, you do have some more muscle, but that doesn't mean that, you're blowing out of your clothes. If someone is really concerned because they're more mesomorphic and they can put muscle definition on easily, and they're saying, well, my clothes aren't fitting more, then we can modify the kind of training that they're doing to become more metabolic. So this is more of our upper reps, more endurance type work. And that's what women are used to. And this starts to change instead of more power based, which makes people feel like they're going to blow out of their shirts, into more of that Pilates type stuff that we don't necessarily really want to promote when we're looking at older women, but it does help with the mental effect of feeling like they're going to blow out of their shirts.
Right. And, one of the reasons that somebody may feel or look bulky is because they might frankly be eating too many calories. So, moving into talking about nutrition, when somebody's looking to build muscle, like what's a good framework to follow from a nutrition perspective to make sure that they're not going to gain as much body fat when doing so?
This is a complex question. So I bring it back to circadian rhythm and chronobiology. So we talk about circadian rhythms, and everyone thinks about it as a 24-hour clock, but it's not. For women, our circadian pulse is a little bit shorter than men's. And in that, we have hormone pulses. And where I'm going with this is that When we look at circadian malalignment or a misstep in our circadian rhythm, we see that women end up having a change in their appetite hormones. So they end up having more cravings, they end up having a precedence for wanting more carbohydrate, and they don't feel full. So when we talk about what changes our circadian rhythm, it's delaying food and not looking at daylight and then eating late. So when I bring it to women saying, look, we want to build muscle and reduce body fat, but specifically really reduce visceral fat. We want to eat according to our circadian rhythm. So that means for women, because we have a higher cortisol peak within a half an hour of waking up as compared to men, we need to have a little bit of protein and carbohydrate to dampen that peak and to tell the hypothalamus that we have some nutrition ready to go and we're good to go for the day. And we want to eat protein at every meal, hitting about 40 grams. And we want to make sure that we are fueling for our training and recovering from our training. And then we have dinner, but we don't have anything after dinner. So it might be using buzzwords of a 7 to 7 overnight fast, which is a 12-hour fast, but really we're working with our circadian rhythm. When we look at the research that shows by working with our circadian rhythm or eating according to how our body needs fuel, we have less circadian malalignment, so we have less interruption in our appetite hormones. We have less precedence for blood sugar irregularities. We have less of a stimulus for putting on body fat. And then when women are like, wait, I need to lose some weight too, it's like, okay, well, if we want to lose a little bit more body fat, then we take maybe 150 calories away from the night meal. And this is a small enough calorie deficit, and it's going to allow your body to digest better so that overnight it can get into all its reparation it needs to do. So there isn't a magic bullet to it. It's more about timing. And when we're talking about the quality of food, like I said, I'm not a huge calorie in, calories out person because 4 calories of carbs react differently in the body than 4 calories of protein. So we have to be very mindful of the timing and the nutrition density of the food that we're eating.
It's interesting coming from like a science background that you're not as, excited or I guess dogmatic about the calories in, calories out approach. Talk more in depth about why and some things for people to keep in mind as they're eating food throughout the day.
Yeah. So calories and the nutrition label of calories all stemmed from a research point of view of trying to really determine the energy that was associated with food. And it's a rough calculation. So when we start looking at the non-mathematical aspect of food and energy of food, it reacts differently in the body. So like I said, 4 calories of carbohydrate have a different response than 4 calories of protein. Those 4 calories of carbohydrate coming from a carrot is completely different from 4 calories of carbohydrate coming from carrot juice. And people are like, why? It's because the carrot has fiber, carrot juice does not. The fiber really helps to avoid any kind of blood sugar flux that happens when you get fruit sugars. And yes, carrots have a higher amount of fructose in it. And the fiber also helps with the gut microbiome. The juice doesn't. So when we start getting into the nuances of calories in, calories out, that 4 grams or 4 calories from carbohydrate from the carrot, is it juice or is it the whole carrot? Completely different responses in the body. So when we start looking at how we should be eating, I really want people to understand that we want to take care of our gut microbiome first. So more fibery foods, more colorful fruit and veg, and really good protein. Trying to not reach for, I was in the States recently and saw protein fortified Pop-Tarts. I was like, that completely misses the mark. That's not what we want to get from our protein, right?
Sounds delicious though.
Every once in a while, if it's in the 20% rule, but
Protein Pop-Tarts, come on now.
I know. I just think ultra processed. Where is it coming from? But yeah, and as an expat, I find it really interesting the two different food systems. Well, like I've traveled to Europe, I live in New Zealand, I go back to the States on a regular basis. And I go to the States and I walk into a grocery store and there's rows and rows and rows and rows and rows and rows of things that they say is food, but can't eat it. I can eat the fruit and veg. I can eat some of the other things, but there's so much packaging and sugar and additives and ultra processed stuff that it's no wonder people are confused.
So your rationale for focusing on quality, versus the quantity of the food really revolves around like how people will feel after eating them, well, and also from a performance perspective and from a like a longevity perspective and how they impact you from a physiological level, impact things like the gut microbiome, et cetera, right?
Yep, absolutely. And the timing's important too, to avoid the hypothalamus going, hey, I'm in a low energy state. Because if we exercise on an empty stomach as a woman, or we delay food intake post exercise as a woman or a man, then the brain perceives you as being in a low energy state. And the automatic response is down regulating all the systems in the body. And that's counterproductive. So if I talk to a woman, she's like, oh, yeah, I went to the gym, I had coffee before, and then I wasn't hungry afterwards, and I was rushing around and I didn't have food until 11 or 12. I'm like, why'd you go to the gym? Because you stayed in a breakdown state the whole time. You didn't have any impetus for building muscle.
So if you were to like lay out a few golden rules for nutrition other than focusing on quality instead of like calories in, calories out, what would you say for a woman who's listening to this who wants to again build some muscle, make sure she's also improving her body compositions, not gaining too much fat? Like what are a few rules you think everybody should follow?
Really trying to focus on getting 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. And we want to distribute that evenly throughout the day. So it's not like having a big whack of protein in the morning and then kind of scuttling off throughout the rest of the day. It's really making sure that you're getting 40-ish grams at breakfast, 40-ish grams at lunch, and 40 or 50 grams at dinner. Also, taking an eye that you want a lot of colorful fruit and veg as your carbohydrate, and you can accent that with what we call the 20% rule. So that's where your protein Pop Tart comes into play if you wanted it, you know. So it's the protein and the fiber that become really important when we're looking to fuel well and to build muscle and prevent that body fat from coming on.
And then what do you think about like the difference between different proteins, like animal versus plant protein? I know there's been a lot of debate over that over the years. I think that, you know, sometimes if people don't like certain types of animal protein, it becomes incredibly hard to get it from plants unless they're super strategic about it. What is your advice on like the best sources of protein?
Well, when we look from like a rating perspective, we see the egg white is at that 100 mark. Whey protein isolate, dairy products are above it. And then we start to see pea protein isolate below it. When we're talking about animal versus plant, I might get slammed for this. It doesn't really matter, right? What we're looking at is the quality of the protein. So, yes, protein supplementation from powders is fine, but you don't want that to be your mainstay. If you're looking at trying to get protein in as a vegan or someone who's plant based, you want to make sure that you're getting lots of different types of fruit and veg that also have protein in it. So, it can be your sprouted grain bread with peas, green peas, nuts, seeds. Maybe you have a tempeh sandwich. In the morning, you're having chia seeds and oats that have been soaked in some oat milk or almond milk, and then you're adding some nuts and some berries and stuff. So it's not about going for that big, meat and 2 veg. It's about looking at all the spectrum and making sure that you're getting protein from a whole bunch of different sources that fill up your plate.
You know, going low carb, carnivore, keto, etc., has become more popular over the last few years. Specifically, like carnivore, like eating like zero carbs, like zero vegetables, and just eating straight up meat. Talk about the dangers of that from a hormonal perspective for women.
Oh my gosh, I look at that and I think, oh, your poor gut. Because the gut microbiome is so important, right? And we see that part of how hormones are regulated for women is through what we call a second pass. So that means hormone metabolites are bound in the liver and then shot into the gut and then unconjugated or removed from sex hormone binding globulin by our gut bugs and then shot back out. If we don't have diversity or we have a very low amount of these gut bugs, then we have hormone dysfunction. We're not optimizing our hormones. When we start looking at other things that our gut microbiome does with regards to vitamin production, the gut-brain axis, with regards to mood, to serotonin, we see 95% of our serotonin is made in the gut. There's lots of disruption that comes from neurotransmitters and hormones when we don't take care of our gut microbiome. So if we're having no fiber or very limited fiber, then we are reducing the diversity of the gut microbiome. And the longitudinal aspect of having a very low diversity is poor health.
And so what do you tell the person that's like, well, I need to cut out all carbs so I can lose body fat?
I look at them and go, well, actually, no, women need carbs, and you're not going to be able to lose body fat if you don't have carbs because your body is looking for a carbohydrate in order to fuel mitochondria to be able to use free fatty acids at rest and during exercise. We also see that the carbs from fruit and veg are very powerful anti-inflammatory, antioxidative agents. And we start having a misstep in our estrogen, we need those because estrogen is a powerful anti-inflammatory agent. And we need that in order for the liver to understand free fatty acids shouldn't become visceral fat. So we look at carbohydrate intake. It's not about the white breads. It's not about the simple carbs. It's about the kinds of foods that you're eating that provide the fiber for your gut. And the other thing with regards to body composition is we see in the 4 to 5 years before that one point in time menopause, there's a significant decrease in the gut microbiome diversity. And this is directly related to an increase in body fat and decrease in lean mass. So we have to be very cognizant of taking care of that gut microbiome. And the way we do that is with fiber, and fiber comes from carbohydrate rich sources.
This episode is brought to you by Element. Whether or not you're working out, hydration is so important. Water alone is key, but drinking water on its own sometimes just doesn't cut it. That's where Element electrolytes come in. They have formulated a science-backed electrolyte ratio that tastes absolutely amazing. Plus, doesn't have any sugar, artificial colors, or other sketchy ingredients to hold you back. I've been using Element for years, and my favorite flavor is definitely the citrus salt. I take it either first thing in the morning when I wake up or after a workout or a run. After taking it, I always feel replenished and ready to move on to the next thing I am doing. I know when I am properly hydrated, I perform and feel my best. So if you're looking to optimize your hydration, go to drinklmnt.com/DougBopst to get a free sample pack with any purchase. Again, go to drinklmnt.com/DougBopst or click the link below for a free sample pack with any purchase. Now back to the show. So I've heard you talk about in our conversation like circadian biology and optimizing feeding windows and stuff. And the topic of fasting has become highly debated over the last several years, specifically, I think within, how women should fast compared to men. How do you view time restricted feeding as it pertains to women? How do you believe, based on the research, that women should do it effectively so that they're not crushing their hormones in a negative way or negatively impacting their health?
The bottom line is an overnight fast, which is using the buzzwords. You have that 12-hour, if you have a higher cancer risk than 13 to 14-hour overnight fast. So it could be 6 p.m. to 8 a.m. But the really important thing is that you are having some food within a half an hour of waking up. Because it's important to signal the hypothalamus, that is the control center for so many metabolic processes, that there is nutrition coming in. When we start looking at the research on intermittent fasting and comparing it to calorie restriction, they see that there's no difference in weight loss between the two. It's just some people find doing fasting is easier with regards to restricting calories. But the caveat there is when you look at the research, they don't account for the quality of the food that's in the eating window. So when we're looking at all these warrior or long fasting episodes and short eating windows, people are trying to get as many calories as they can in there, but they're not paying attention to the quality. Whereas if we look at time restricted eating, which is that overnight fast, or, having a set time where you're not eating, preferably, like I said, overnight, then the time that you are eating is focusing on the quality. So when you're reading the literature, there's a difference between time restricted eating and fasting based on what is happening in that eating window.
Got it. And then what about like fasting around the menstrual cycle? Like I know, you've talked about how women can optimize their nutrition and their strength training around the timing of their cycle. What is your like updated position on that? And how can people do it in a way that's going to improve the way they manage things?
One critical factor that I've been noticing and why my thought process has changed a little bit is ovulation. We're seeing an incredible upsurge of anovulatory cycles, meaning you don't have ovulation in just the general population. And in the athletic population, it's becoming a massive issue. If you don't ovulate, you don't produce progesterone and you don't have an estrogen surge. So if you don't have that, you have a pretty stable hormone profile. You will have a bleed with an anovulatory cycle, so you can't really tell if you have an anovulatory cycle or not. So when we start talking about fasting around the menstrual cycle, there's no real rhyme or reason to it. There's no evidence to say that you should be, even if you are ovulating. And when you think about it, it's the time leading up to ovulation, the body's becoming very stress resilient. So you need nutrition to be stress resilient, to have a good immune system. Post ovulation, your body's building tissue. It's all about building endometrial lining, and it has an increase in the calorie and food needs, particularly carbohydrate and protein. So neither one of those makes sense to be fasting around it. We talk about tracking menstrual cycle as becoming more of that individual basis. It's like you know your own patterns and you can see changes in bleed patterns, you see changes in how you feel, then you can change your training around that. But we don't want people to blanket say, I'm going to do this to this phase and then I'm going to take 2 weeks off. It was never our intent to say that. It was, we want to, make sure that you're able to push when your body is stress resilient, and we want you to be able to kind of bring it down or deload a little bit right before you have your period, because your body's not very stress resilient at all.
So specifically, what do you think are a few like minor shifts people can make around that time that could also maybe be implemented for the rest of the month, so that it's not something drastic where they're doing it for a week or two and then going back to a completely different routine afterwards?
It's pretty boring, but it's the same thing. It's, you stop eating dinner 2 to 3 hours before bed and you fuel during the day. You fuel for what you are doing. It's not about holding food until noon and then having food. It's really listening to fueling when your body needs it. And a lot of people say, well, I'm not hungry till 10 or 11. Well, you've been conditioned not to be that way because you've spent this whole time like just drinking coffee and water and then not having food until noon. Your body is conditioned to that, but you can reteach it. You can learn hunger cues, and we want to fuel during the day and not eat late. And so we can have really good recovery overnight. And if you hold that across all cycles, all hormone profiles, all age groups, it works on so many different molecular levels into the whole body. And we see really good longevity outcomes from that.
Right. I want to dive into cardio more when it comes to like, women specifically. Like, what do you think, like, from a blanket perspective, are the most like effective forms of cardio for women? And obviously, if you think it's different based on their age, I mean, I'd love for you to go into that as well.
Yeah, when we're looking at the younger age group, like I said, you can get away with a lot of things. If you want to do 2 F45 classes back to back, go for it. But when you start getting older, you need to be very acutely aware of how to polarize. So we want to do true high intensity work, or we want to do true sprint interval work, because we have to be able to capitalize on these external stressors to now create adaptations. I have a lot of endurance athletes that are like, well, what about wanting to do a 3-day bike packing tour? Or maybe I have some gravel races coming up, or I'm training for a marathon, or I'm training for a 10K or an ultra. I'm not saying to completely mark that off. I'm saying that the bread and butter of what you should be doing as you get older is quality training, not volume. So if you are training for an ultra, it's not the old school of running 20 hours a week. It's let's look at how we are building strength, how we're doing some top end work, and then we spend time on our feet every 10 to 15 days where we go out for 2 really long days at a time. So there's ways of peppering in endurance, but the benchmark is doing that polarized training and strength training. When we're younger, like I said, you can get away with a lot of stuff. You can go for lots of endurance stuff. You can do lots of high intensity work. You can play around with a whole bunch of different things. But as you get older, we have to have that eye to how are we polarizing our training so that we get better blood glucose control, so we get better conversation between the skeletal muscle and the liver so that we don't store visceral fat. How do we have better conversations to create epigenetic changes so that we maintain the quality of our muscle and the quality of our bone? Because those are so key in being able to live independently as we get older.
Right. And I know you're not a fan of doing like things like fasted strength training, but what about like if somebody wants to go for like a walk in the morning fasted? Do you think that there's benefit to that? Do you think there's not a benefit? Like, what are your thoughts?
From a mindfulness perspective, yeah, people get out first thing in the morning in nature. That's great. If they're doing any kind of intensity, then it starts to create a disruption that causes catabolism. That and the first thing to go is lean mass. And like I said, it's really hard for women to build mass, really hard for women to keep it. So if you're going to go do something that's long and fasted, that's going to be counterproductive and stimulate the body to break it down, you just want to have a pause and think about that.
Right. So you don't think there's benefits for like fat loss if people are doing fasted cardio? I mean, I know that's been kind of debunked. I feel like over the last probably 5 years, I've seen it. There's been a lot of research against it, but I mean, I know that was like an old thing people used to do to burn fat. Like,
Yeah, and it comes down to women are already really efficient fat burners because we have those sex differences from birth where women have more endurance oriented oxidative fibers. We have better mitochondria, better respiration. We have better metabolic flexibility. So all of these things that come up as go for fasted training, go for a fasted walk for fat burning are all if you're a guy. If you're a guy, you want to become more like a woman, sweet. Go do all your fasted stuff. Then you'll become very endurant and metabolically flexible like women. But for women, it doesn't do the same.
gotcha. From like a longevity perspective, I know like the biggest thing that you've been stressing or pushing in the conversation has been like strength training and making sure you have quality muscle as you age. Are there any other things you think are important for women to focus on to make sure that they're living not just longer, but a better quality of life as they get older?
Yeah, a big thing that comes up is joint and joint issues. We see a lot of inflammation, soft tissue injuries, joint pain, joint issues. So this is where the mobilization and mobility come into work. Kelly and Juliet Starr are good friends of mine, and I love their Ready State and all their mobility work that they do because it's so critical for maintaining joint integrity. So when women start getting into perimenopause and having plantar fascia issues, frozen shoulder, joint issues, it's all about taking care of that soft tissue around the joint. And that's where mobility comes into play. So really working on mobility to maintain range of motion and reduce any kind of sticky point of soft tissues as you get older.
Things like sauna, cold water exposure, cryotherapy, stuff like that has become widely popular over recent years as well. What are your thoughts on that as it relates to what we're talking about?
It's like the icing, right? We want everyone to look at all their lifestyle stuff. But if you're going to go down the route of using environmental stuff, which is fantastic, near and dear to me because I'm an environmental physiologist, we have to look at the different sex differences and responses. So something like cryotherapy, way too cold for women. If we look at cold water immersion, you want to be around 55 degrees Fahrenheit or 16 degrees Celsius. That's cold enough for women to invoke all the metabolic and parasympathetic responses. Because if you get into the really cold stuff, it causes too much of a vasoconstrictive response. And then it's a threat to the body. And you don't get the same benefit. If you look at the sauna, everyone responds well to the sauna. Everyone responds well to the heat. We see cardiovascular adaptations, we see hormone changes, we see better blood glucose control. So if you have to pick, of course, I'll push people to the sauna. But a lot of people are like, I don't like to heat. And you're still going to get all the parasympathetic responses too. Yeah, there is some benefit in the cold as long as it's not too cold. And there's definitely benefit for sauna exposure and heat exposure.
So, as somebody who's an environmental physiologist, like what factors do you think play the biggest role in women regarding their health, aging, etc.?
I think we live in a society that is too comfortable. We all have air conditioning, we have heat, we, don't want to go out if it's raining. We never challenge ourselves. I think the biggest thing that women can do is have a challenge every day. So either it's a mental challenge or it's a physical challenge. We're looking at environmental challenges as well. We have to become comfortable with being uncomfortable because we live in a society that just makes everything so in a box that the body is never challenged.
From a supplementation perspective, what are your thoughts on supplements for women? What are some, generally speaking, that you think are effective? What are some that are being pushed that you think are ineffective?
If we look at the performance side of supplementation, there's been some really fantastic reviews and audits that come out and show that almost nothing in the supplement world has been tested or work on women.
Really? That's interesting. So nothing, no supplements?
So we look at protein powders, yes, for sure. We look at beta alanine, yes, that works too. There's good research for that. We look at creatine, definitely, from health and performance standpoint. But then we look at something like nitrates. Nitrates, it's a double-edged sword. So we see that in younger women who are still in their reproductive years, it actually decreases performance, decreases VO, and has a counter effect. But for women who are postmenopausal, it has benefit. It causes vasodilation, and it actually does have a benefit. And it has to do with estrogen because estrogen is tied to the nitric oxide cycle that is responsible for blood vessel and blood vessel control. When we look at things like vitamin D, yes, it works. It works with a timing effect where we want to have it after training to help reduce hepcidin so that we can have optimal iron. But then we start looking at all the other things that are out there, and there really isn't very much robust research for women and very small amount of research for men.
And so you think mostly it's all overhyped, except for protein, creatine, beta alanine, essentially everything else you think is just a waste of people's money?
Yeah, for the most part. I mean, it's an individual case by case basis, right? So if you find something and it works for you, great. The exception, of course, is adaptogens because that's a completely different category than general supplements. So, yeah, I mean, I get questions all the time about all these things that come up for mitochondrial health or for mobilizing fat. And you look and it's been done on rats, but it hasn't been done on people.
And so do you think that a lot of, because you will hear people who take supplements like, oh my gosh, like I feel so much better after taking this, or I notice this is helping me lose body fat. Do you think that's generally speaking placebo?
Because a lot of times when people start taking a supplement, it's because they've noticed something in themselves. We're like, I don't feel that great. I might need some iron. I don't feel that great. Maybe I need some XYZ. So not only are they paying attention to how they feel, but then they start cleaning up their diet as well. Right. And so when you start cleaning up your diet and supplementing, you're going to feel better. It doesn't necessarily mean that the supplement is the X factor, it's the combination of things.
That's so true. Anything else you think would be important to mention within the context of what we're talking about regarding women's health and tips for them to optimize things like, burning body fat, building muscle, and living longer?
Yeah. One of the things that I was actually having a conversation with a couple of colleagues this morning looking at DEXAs. So people will go get a DEXA scan, right? And they'll go, oh, I have really good body composition. I have really good bone density. But what I want women who are 35 plus is not to pay attention so much about body composition, percent body fat, is visceral fat or visceral fat, depending on where you come from. Because there's been some recent medical cohorts where we have seen women who've come in with a long history of endurance. And so, from a general practitioner point of view, they're generally healthy. They look healthy, they exercise on a regular basis. But then we get their DEXA results and their blood results. And we see that, yeah, they might be 20% body fat, but their visceral fat is above 100 cubic centimeters, which means that they have an elevated risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And we get their blood results, and their LDL is elevated, their total cholesterol is elevated, and their A1C is elevated. So it's not protective when we're looking at the endurance exercise. So if you are a generally active woman who spends a lot of time doing endurance and you're 35 plus, if you get a DEXA, find out that visceral fat, find out your blood work, because it's better to take action now than when you're 45 or 50 and you're faced with lots of blood lipid issues and insulin resistant issues and high visceral fat.
Right. So do the same tips apply regarding like losing visceral fat? like strength training, cleaning up your diet, improving your overall health and wellness, like lifestyle and stuff like that?
Yeah, so we see the strongest impetus for losing visceral fat is resistance training and sprint training, because what that does is it creates a conversation from myokines to the liver. And then the liver is like, hey, these free fatty acids now need to go into the muscle. I don't have to esterify them and store them as visceral fat. So if you're looking for the biggest bang for your buck, it's you go in, you do some heavy lifting, finish with some sprint intervals, and get out. It works for men too, but it's really important for women.
Well, Dr. Sims, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for your time. I think the audience can get a ton of value out of this.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
You got it.
Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, I really think you're going to like this video as well. I'll see you there.